having a desire to act all the time, to experiment, to tinker around, but knowing that tinkering will not work 90% of the time, dealing with that risk, you take two steps forward, you take one step backward and iterate. Sometimes it takes years, but as long as you have that strong belief that you have the right idea and make sure that there are like-minded people and hopefully executives who will sponsor it, I think Catalyst can be effective.
Hi, I'm Tracy Lovejoy.
And I'm Shannon Lucas. We are the co-CEOs of Catalyst Constellations, which is dedicated to empowering Catalyst to create bold, powerful change in the world.
This is our podcast, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, where we speak with Catalyst executives about ways to successfully lead transformation in large organizations.
Today, I'm super excited to have with me Sandeep Mehta. Sandeep, welcome.
Thank you, Shannon. Great to be here.
Sandeep has an incredible career. Until recently, he was the Chief Technology Officer at the Hartford Financial Services Group in my hometown of Hartford, Connecticut. Prior to the Hartford, he was Executive Vice President and CIO in technology at Wells Fargo. And before that, he was at UBS, where he was Managing Director based in Zurich and Switzerland and Hong Kong, a true global native. Earlier in his career, Sandeep held technology roles at various banks in telecom and consumer electronics. His background in technology includes software development in artificial intelligence, robotics, imaging, and speech recognition, while at companies like Verizon, Philips, and the University of Rochester. His work in AI has resulted in a patent for autonomous vehicle navigation, and he was part of the product team at NYNext, now Verizon, that launched the first consumer AI product voice dialing for the telecom network. He's an advisory board member for the Ethical AI Governance Group and Samba Nova Systems. He's passionate about how AI is going to transform the world, and I can't wait to hear more about it. All right, so that's the official bio. But as I mentioned, I'd love to hear in your words about your catalytic journey and maybe any career highlights that you can share that you're proud of that help us see your catalytic nature.
Sure. Thanks for the wonderful intro, by the way. So I'll kind of try to weave the story and connect to the three main lessons, if you want to put it that way, that I've learned along my journey. So I began my career in the last AI boom, working on self-parking vehicles and voice recognition, as you mentioned. What was clear to me that even then, working as an engineer, that if you don't understand the what, why, for whom, and how much of a product or a set of products, innovation on its own, regardless of technical challenges, is not always going to work. It doesn't mean that you won't innovate, but you won't convert that innovation to successful products. So the first lesson I would say in my first couple of jobs was about purpose. Having a very clear sense of purpose in the organization and as individual contributors to that effort. So in the early 90s, of course, AI 1.0 or 2.0, you can say, went through a change, and I pivoted to financial services just as the web and internet were born, and working on like the first chat application, the first web platform for large global banks. I constantly kept running into the debate that was build versus buy. And now, of course, that's pretty normal. But in the early days, the build versus buy debate was quite passionate because most banks were building things from scratch, custom software, custom platforms. It was very important to get into that debate. I know it's somewhat orthogonal to innovation, but the question was making sure that you have the sponsorship, the second big lessons, to make sure they can pay for the innovation. And they sponsor it in terms of building it and then seeing it successfully deployed and scaled out is very, very important. The sponsoring, both in terms of the money and in terms of the support the organization and the team needs. And then over the last 20 years, I would say I've been involved in various large transformations at banks around the world. And I would say the third big lesson, seeing these transformations in all kinds of operating models, in large companies, medium-sized companies, mostly in finance, I find repeatedly that the humans are kind of an afterthought in those large transformations, so they get left behind in the big journey. But you can't treat people like rubber balls. They bounce back every time, like the rest of the work keeps bouncing back. They're not as elastic and resilient as rubber balls. So identifying what types of change people can embrace and can champion and make sure that they are part of that journey is super important. More often than not, the best ideas, Shannon, come from within. And so I'll take an example. Overall automation, if you go back 20 years, there have been many evolutions of automation, pre-web, post-web, and now with the advent of AI. If you don't take a humane approach to humans in the loop, then you inevitably have processes that are critical in regulated companies like banks that will work 80% of the time and then have challenges 20% of the time. But when things go wrong, that 20% edge case has to be handled by so-called humans in the loop. And I think that it's very, very important to take a humane approach to humans in the loop with regards to automation, especially with large companies and transformation. So I'd say through my 25 plus year career journey, these three kind of tenets have been very important to me as a catalyst.
Amazing. I'm going to come back to these. I'll go to the next question, and then I'll come back.
Sure.
So in your own words, how do you relate to the concept of catalyst then?
Oh, so, I like the fact the book puts it so simply. It's very readable. I zipped through the first part of the book really fast. So that triumvirate of vision, action, and iteration, I love that. But, more than that, how do you relate as a catalyst? So I saw the attributes, they are constantly ingesting data. I mean, humans are ingesting data and analyzing and processing that data. Doing a what if in their head. What is this about? How can it be applied? You can call it dreaming, imagining, things that large language models can't do. They can't dream and imagine. So you need humans to innovate in that aspect of creativity. But also, in that experimentation, having a desire to act all the time, to experiment, to tinker around, but knowing that tinkering will not work 90% of the time, dealing with that risk, dealing with the kind of vagueness of the problem. You take 2 steps forward, you take 1 step backward, and iterate. Sometimes it takes years. But as long as you have that strong belief that you have the right idea and make sure that there are like-minded people and hopefully executives who will sponsor it, I think Catalyst can be effective.
So much wisdom to unpack. So I would love to go back to your 3 key takeaways from your journey, the purpose of the transformation or the innovation. I'm wondering how you get clarity on that. Is that your own personal purpose? Are you aligning to the organization? What are steps that you do to get clear on purpose?
How about I say that it's important to know what not to do. So tackling a very big problem is hard to completely articulate and ideate and get support for and sponsorship for. So I would say take a small problem, but perfect it and use that, or multiple small problems, because ultimately, the kind of snowball effect will kick in, or the flywheel effect will kick in. So perfecting a solution to a small problem is very, very important before you tackle huge problems, because it also demonstrates your success. It builds trust amongst organization, because we are still made of people is super important. I also would say that inevitably in the innovation journey, you're going to partner with people. So 2 things there. First of all, the journey is going to be long, so measurement is important, but people confuse, are we measuring what matters or making what we measure matter? And that latter may not be true. So it's super important to really focus on measure what matters. So that's one thing. The second part is, with new technology innovation, it's very easy to get advocates who say yes, but it's important to focus on people who write checks. Having customers, internal or external, who say, I believe in this, yes, and I will support it by sponsoring it financially and otherwise adopting the solution, is better than saying yes, and I'll do a POC and then it'll wither on the vine. So I think that's very important to make that distinction and make sure that you can align yourselves to people who are willing to write checks for your innovation and inventions.
It's such an important step in the process. And I sort of have two questions around that. One is, I mean, maybe it's actually just one question, which is like, you can't bring those people in too early because they won't know what they're sponsoring. But if you bring them in too late, you've lost the guidance, the other forms of support. I'm wondering how you know like when to engage the person to write the check, and how you know what the needle is for them that's going to get them on board.
I think so, I was surprised to find out that the innovator's dilemma goes back to the 70s in terms of the original concepts. It happens to repeat itself so often. It's super important for companies not to focus on the most lucrative end of like the incumbent customer, incumbent products, but say, what is the mass consumer want and how can this new technology emerging address that mass market? And inevitably, technology goes through iterations of improvement and eventually takes over. That's true of, if you look at, one of my catalyst role models, if you want to put it that way, is Reed Hastings. He was a maths teacher, then a software developer, and created pure software, which I used avidly in my coding days. And then with the whole DVD experience, I remember hearing an interview where he said, we kind of did the math on what the modems of the 90s would take to deliver a whole DVD worth of a movie to your home. It would take 5 hours per gigabyte. And the average movie is a couple of gigabytes. So you can imagine saying, okay, well, if that's the case, then a DVD through USPS is going to get there faster. And they perfected that DVD delivery system. But it was having that prescience to say, we want to get to this end goal, but today only this is possible. So let's perfect what's possible in a small way. And as a very early Netflix customer, I love that service, even though it depended on the mail service.
You hit on something fascinating, which is sometimes when there's disruptive things that we're pitching to organizations, there are metrics that we can look at, even if we don't know how much people will pay for the new service. For example, there's a metric that we can say, well, they're not going to do this. Sometimes though, it's a whole new like market that you're opening up. The McKinsey report isn't written. And so I'm curious, like, again, going back to like, you need the sponsor who's going to give you the funding. How do you navigate or how get them on board in that gray area where it's just like, we don't know how much people will pay for the DVD thing because it's not Blockbuster and it's not that.
Yes, exactly. And so I'd kind of partition markets and products into two categories, enterprise and consumer. I'd say for enterprise, there's a kind of half art, half science to pricing your product and service. You can't make it consumer grade cheap because people will naturally disbelieve, oh, but this can't be any good for the enterprise because it's so affordable. Now, that's changed recently with SaaS services. But you can't make it so expensive that only Fortune 100 companies can afford it. On the consumer end, it's very important to it's kind of the principle of capitalism. You charge people as much as they're willing to bear and be willing to change that policy very quickly. A lot of companies have tried this freemium model, but they don't have that inflection point that they say, okay, the freemium model doesn't work. We've got to start charging customers from the first day onwards. Digital publishing with newspapers is an interesting example. Some companies believe in the freemium model. Some companies will paywall their content right away. And then ultimately, they have to do a trial and error with consumers. And mostly it's error to say, how much is our content worth? And constantly be doing price tuning, discounts, experiments in the market until they discover the sweet spot. But so far in digital publishing, and this is true of digital streaming as well, it's a kind of barbell shape. You have a large number of consumers going for the pure free model and a smaller end of the barbell that are willing to pay the premium price. And unfortunately, it's not great for artists, content creators, writers, publishers, because at the barbell, they can't generate enough revenue at the premium end, and they still need the mass consumer support in case that there's a turnover rate that they can convert some of these people. So it's a experimentation. I think we've had 20 years of digital media and publishing and streaming, and we are still experimenting.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting insight, which is like, and it does go back to the sort of vision, action, iteration thing of the catalyst too, which is like, you have a hypothesis, you try it out, you get the data, you have to understand your context first and foremost. Like, am I in enterprise or am I in consumer, and getting more granular on that? And then just the data and the constant willingness to reevaluate.
Yeah.
Okay, I also want to go to the third one that you talked about, because you said, humans can't be an afterthought. And if you look at like the normal distribution of change, right, from the catalyst innovators to the laggards, et cetera, there's a huge, there's a huge range there with the employees who are probably in your organization. And we talk a lot about the emotional labor that catalysts have in terms of bringing the organization along on the change. I'm wondering if you have any advice about how to like leverage your energy super strategically so that you're bringing the humans along, but not burning yourself out in the process.
That's a challenge, because, it's, especially when you kind of have an executive hat on, you are spending a lot of time in your day making high impact decisions, but they are usually on the kind of finance side or the administrative side or the HR side. And it's super important to carve out time for yourself to say, how do I rejuvenate, refresh? If you have a curious mind, how am I getting, constant new data? So being curious, learning all the time, having mentors that can look outward for those mentors to give you affirmation, because it's very difficult to look inwards and find people who affirm your thoughts, your ideas, your efforts. They're rarely going to be able to do that because everyone's working on a short horizon. I think it's hard to say that happiness and truth and beauty are essential to technology. So, it reminds me of a book in 1932. You'd probably know it, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So the dilemma is, in that utopian world of technology, I think the quote goes something like, we don't want to change because every change is a menace to stability, but today's stability is tomorrow's misery for a lot of people. So I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that the people will naturally be wary, but be very open, non-defensive to getting the feedback, getting the challenge. It's a kind of way off field example, but return to work post-COVID. And in my last job, I was heading the committee that was supposed to implement return to work. It was the easy part was getting the logistics worked out, getting the technology worked out, getting the HR process worked out, getting the data gathering and reporting worked out for executives. But the messaging and socializing was super hard because no matter what we tried, we were not allowed to use the word mandate. We had to take significant feedback, basically calling us hypocrites, because it said, people have been working this way, in some cases for a decade, and highly productive. So why does driving 30 miles into the office make it better for us? And we did not have enough credible examples to bring them on board and earn their trust. So people, even though we didn't say mandate, we effectively signaled to them that this is a mandate and you got to do it. And people did it, but they were very grudging about it. So it is an important lesson to acknowledge that you will be met with skepticism. You will be met with resistance. If you take a hard line towards skepticism and resistance, you will probably lose a lot of people. But on the other hand, you cannot have a perpetual debate and accommodate all the skepticism and resistance. I kind of use a rule of thirds, Shannon. So in any change, organizational, transformational, innovation-led change, the rule of thirds is a third of the people will see it, get it, run towards that, embrace it. A third of the people will see it, maybe skeptical, but they said, I'll embrace it if you help me.
Mm.
give me the support, the training, the learning, and be empathetic. And third of the people absolutely won't get it or don't want to get it. And you have to accommodate those people in a humane manner. So example I give is, all these companies are now legacy organizations are transforming to the cloud. And so they'll put a whole program management structure, but then they will also create a training program for everyone. It's really important to say, yeah, it's a training program, but it's optional. It's not a mandate. Where I see a mandate, I get howls of protest coming from my former staff that said, hey, Sandeep, I've been programming in COBOL for decades and I'm going to retire in 5 years. Why do I have to become an AWS engineer? You have to have those exceptions handled humanely because people don't necessarily want to or believe in that change as it's not relevant to them or will not be relevant to them eventually.
It's so interesting because we increasingly have this conversation with organizations. Again, if I go back to sort of the normal distribution of change curve, you may have historically been at one place. Like if you're heavily regulated industry on the like market wide spectrum, it may be, further down than a tech company as an example. But I think what we're seeing, especially since the pandemic, I mean, some of us have been talking about the VUCA reality for a really long time, right? But is like the whole body of the organization has to move more to the agility and be able to respond to change. But what I love in what you just said is it's a yes and, because there's some people, it's like,
Yes.
look, if they're a few years away from retiring, like having the one-off perspectives, I think is challenging as a leader and necessary to help bring the organization along.
And you always have to do it pretty publicly, even when you're going against the grain and giving these people the exceptions, whether it's, return to work or, getting cloud certified after years of programming in COBOL. It's important because more news travels through the grapevine, especially if it's negative news. So I think what's that thing about, good news is barely getting out of bed while bad news has traveled around the world.
Yeah, 100%. It's so interesting. And I want to go back and highlight too, because as you started to answer this follow-up question about like, how do you bring people along and the risk of burnout, you called out some really important things. And I love your clarity. You're like, this is what I need. I need to carve out time for myself. I need to make sure that I'm rejuvenating, but it's not just rejuvenating. Like for us as catalysts, like having time built in for the curious exploration of all of the different, reports or sci-fi things or whatever is coming out, I think is super important. So I don't want to miss that super important point because
No, it may vary by people, but for me, cinema, theater, reading, music are all fueling that, what if, what about. It can just be happy accidents that you realize just sitting somewhere completely disconnected from your day job, so to speak.
catalyst happy hours on a rooftop in New York as an example. The collisions
Yes.
happen. Okay.
Yes to that.
100%. Maybe you answered some of these, but I'll ask it a different way. So what are some of the challenges that you had as a Catalyst executive, maybe one or two, and what most helped you overcoming those? We also invite stories of failure because sometimes those are the biggest learnings, but what would you like to share there?
I would say, it goes back to the kind of three lessons through my career on purpose, sponsors, and humane humanity. I've faced the latter two challenges more than one situation. So I think, as we talked about, like maintaining your center and making sure that you kind of have the time to self-care in quotes, being able to reach out to mentors who are like-minded, looking outwards. It's very easy to it's a lot like entrepreneurs. They take their startup pitch, 10 times, 20 times, and hear 99% no's, but they either have a very strong belief or they get affirmation of their ideas and beliefs in the face of all that adversity from the outside. And that's super important. Or even if you are, there's a great quote from Jamie Dimon after he lost his job at Citigroup, and he said, "I lost my job, so it may impact my net worth, not my self-worth."
That's an amazing one for Catalyst. That's so important. It can be so hard. And because we can, even when we're doing our best work and trying to be in service of organizations, we often can become the lightning rod of the resistance of change, right? And so probably the number of people, the percentage of catalysts that let go, even like Jamie Dimon, is higher in this population, but it's not a reflection of who we, our worth as people, which I absolutely love.
Another person who really kind of took that approach to realizing, well, it's a bit different. I'm going to talk about Ed Catmull and the founding of Pixar. I mean, he came from academia. He was supposed to be in New York, but ended up getting pitched to start a company called Pixar. Throughout his and his book Creativity is a must read. I don't know if you read it, but
I haven't. I'll add it to the list.
Throughout the book, he talks about his approach to empowering people because of Pixar is a creative enterprise, how to embrace creativity, failure, and trying to do it in a very candid manner. It's pretty unique compared to the norm in corporate management. In fact, at Pixar, they call it the brains trust. So you attack problems. You could have a script. You could have an animation not running well, especially before the current age of graphic supercomputers came about. So frequently you've got almost the entire script finished and the movie, rough cuts are done, and you've got to go back to the drawing board. And I think the brains trust was like this closed, trusting environment where people could, clash ideas, but not clash people or attack people. And it allowed the company to thrive, through great periods of stress, and making sure the leadership allowed that to happen, that brains trust exist, and B, thrive in the face of conflict, was super important to people feeling affirmed about their attempts, their efforts, failures, and successes.
It's so important, and it's so important for catalysts. And I am so guilty of doing this, but I often conflate the idea or the thing that I'm trying to birth in the world with myself or my self-worth. And I think we almost have an obligation to the rest of our team to distance ourselves and be like, here, and you talked about curiosity, like, hey, I'm okay if you want to tear this apart or tear it down to the ground or whatever. I'm offering this in service based on the scanning that I've done. I think we can help co-create those environments like the brain trust that you're talking about. So it's not the personal piece. I love that.
Yeah. It's funny. I was writing my thoughts out, and I remembered, a funny question I got asked when I finished my master's degree. I had not yet defended, but I'd finished all the work. And my roommate or a friend asked me, like, what would you do differently? And I said, I'd throw this whole thing away and redo it.
Exactly right.
The effort of the 6, 8, 9 months was enough learning to realize that if you got a second chance at a do-over, you do it completely differently.
Yeah. And that's so good, because we as a community can get arrogant about our ideas sometimes. And I think it's important to be like, actually, if I'm honest with myself, I would have done X, Y, or Z differently.
Yep.
I also want to come back because I forgot to mention, you had said in your thing about like the maintaining your center and the, and your energy mentors, which I think is super important. And sort of building off of that, it's, getting the affirmation from the outside. And I think that's such an interesting sort of call to action too. Like, when I was leading innovation at Vodafone, it would be like, I might have an idea, but it was like 10 customer workshops with the C-suite where I could say, this isn't Shannon's idea. This is the C-suite of the top 10 customers that you're going after. And it's such an important reminder for us too, like, because we can drink our own Kool-Aid, right?
I think most companies, public companies, maybe this is kind of finance industry specific, they think that, for and technical people are creative, that giving them, here's the once a year trip to Vegas to go to AWS reInvent or Oracle World is sufficient because people, want a kind of a quote unquote party. and get swag and all that, they completely miss the boat. The affirmation you get from being on podcasts like yours, events like the one in New York City, our dinner where you said catalysts are people who bite their tongue for a living. I love that. I absolutely love that. These opportunities to meet like-minded people and hear their stories and say, aha, so I'm not alone,
Yeah.
is affirming. It's super important.
Thank you for reframing that. It's so important. And we know when catalysts are in community, the frictionless of it can just be so liberating. Like, I don't have to bite my tongue. In fact, people are encouraging me to think bigger and bolder and act faster and all of this stuff, which is why I love my job. There's a theme that we've been hearing in the last year about companies being asked to do more with less. And I'm curious about if you have thoughts about this with the intersection of AI, because I know you're super passionate about AI. You're on the, the ethical governance. How do you see those two intersecting and playing out?
So there's, I think the full story has not been written yet. There's a lot of hype, like any technology, curve. I think the real challenge lies in, first of all, technology goes at either extremes, and you have, one extreme, complete advocates and supporters, and then complete skeptics, and in between lies the truth. And so the skeptics are going to point out every failure of language models and algorithm systems and hallucinating, et cetera, et cetera. And the supporters will say AGI is coming tomorrow. But in the middle, there is a whole host of things that we can do that and are doing, I think, for the most part, that address everyday problems for people and companies that it it's sometimes more than good enough for a solution. So I think that's where we should focus. While I'm a strong believer in regulation, and in fact, I would say work with your regulators because they're going to be your friend in the end. Um, I see the whole debate with crypto, like, down with the regulators, etc. It's gotten politicized, but the reality is they're going to be your friend. And it's important to understand, speak their language to understand their concerns. This is equally true in AI, especially with things like AI in healthcare, AI in the military, AI in medicine, in transportation, etc. So it comes back to that. How do you incorporate the human AI hybrid model in the environment? Because the C-suite at most companies right now is not looking at through the lens of productivity and enhancement. They're looking it as, yeah, your productivity is improved by 20%, so now cut your budget by 20%. So I was in the last two board meetings I was at, the theme was pretty clear. No matter what the industry domain, budgets are flat. So if you're going to ask for more investment dollars, then you're going to have to find it within your own budget to fund those investment projects. So AI is going to have to be funded by whatever you're doing, you're going to reduce. So if you believe that AI is going to save developer productivity by 20%, so take down your labor costs for developers by 20%. Now, it's a dangerous situation to make that bet, because what if it doesn't? And recent data says, that one end you have McKinsey 25, 30% productivity improvement, and the reality is coming out to be more like 6 to 8%. So can we kind of take the divide in the middle? Maybe, maybe not. But inevitably, I've found organization leadership will always take the most bullish case that they hear from McKinsey and add another, double-digit percentage to it. So it's super important to be very careful as to, it's like Confucius, be careful what you wish for, you might get it.
Totally. And I think it's such a great example of it's a great stand-in for almost any type of change, because
Exactly.
if you tell the developer community or anyone in the organization, yeah, we're going to give you this tool, but to your point, in the background, everyone knows that there's a RIF coming or some kind of reduction of budget in other places, you've actually really ramped up the resistance for people who might have been the first big embracers otherwise. Do you have advice for executives on how to help navigate that to at least think ahead of the resistance they might be increasing?
I know, look, executives are paid to have those tough conversations, but throughout my career, I've believed in under promise and over deliver. And what I've
Yeah.
seen time and again is over promise, under deliver. And so
Yeah.
then you get burned, and then you say, okay, here comes technology again, trying to sell us a new mousetrap. What's different this time?
Yeah. I love that. That's a personal motto of mine too. Any final points of wisdom for our listeners?
Oh boy. I think it's again the customer focus, expect technology to reinvent things. I like to tell stories and anecdotes, and I just read a case this morning about the CEO of Ford Motor. By the way, Ford has been in China for over 2 decades. And China, with the central government support, has been investing in electric vehicle technology for at least 15, maybe no, 20 years plus. So the, the consumer in China saw the cars are going to be a computer on wheels way before the rest of the world did. So as a result, I would say 6 out of 10 of the top electric car makers are from China. And their growing market share is a testament to how much consumers love their product. Now, tariffs aside, in the UK, they're proving their worth too. In the US, and Ford is a good example, the deliberate ignoring of the, yeah, this is just a toy and focus on the high-end luxury trucks was good, but classic innovator's dilemma. You keep, you know, feeding off the cash cow, and soon the cash cow is, going to be gone. Kodak learned that. Xerox learned that. They're like shadow of their former selves. Kodak is truly a shadow. And I was from Rochester, New York, so Kodak and Xerox were big there, and they're a shadow of their original selves because they did exactly that. They kept focusing on, film cameras and chemistry and photocopiers, and forgot that they did. I mean, who has a photocopier now?
So what's your advice for leaders to navigate bringing in their own disruptive S-curve? I mean, that's really what the innovator's dilemma is about. Like, do you think that large organizations can do that? Or is the hypothesis that it has to start with some other relationship as a, spin
If
in,
they
spin
don't
out?
do it, if they don't do it, it will be thrust on them by the market. I think it's important to do it. You can have a debate about should we do it organically from bottoms up in the organization, or should we do it, you know, either as a joint venture or as a special project, separately protected from the enterprise. I
Right.
would say the latter, but then you have to have a very deliberate, conscious effort on how you kind of stitch that into the DNA of the firm, and not just like say, oh, we're going to have change management. That's the most, overused trope in transformation. We're going to have change management, but really what it is, it's doing road shows and all that stuff. But when the dust settles, people don't embrace it. So I think how that again, humane and human approach to making sure that the fabric of the organization does not have an immune response to the innovation when it's ready.
Sandeep, I could listen to you for hours. I really appreciate your hard-won wisdom, I'm guessing. As a final question, I'd love to understand or hear about your favorite catalyst. Who inspires you, past or present, and why?
I rattled off Reed Hastings and Ed Catmull particularly because he was an academic researcher in computer graphics, and I don't know if you know this, but University of Utah in Salt Lake City was where all the pioneering work happened in computer graphics in the 70s and 80s.
I did not know that. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
The fact that someone who's basically an academic researcher, engineer, pioneer can pivot to being such a successful entrepreneur to such an iconic company is truly like inspiring. Reed Hastings, of course, I mentioned that. I could name lots of people whose book. I will say this: if you read the biography of like Tesla, he had some really wild ideas, and believe it or not, besides Westinghouse, he had one fan, and his fan was John Pierpont Morgan. He got financing from JP Morgan over and over again because he got them to believe in his ideas, but eventually he ran out of cash and did not have product for launching to the market. In the case of AC, he had the support of Westinghouse, so we all now know that AC power is is the standard, not what Edison and GE wanted.
It is fascinating as an example because you really, compared with Edison, it's like you really have to, it's like the inspired genius plus the business acumen, like coming back to the other stakeholders, the market and all of that to make sure that you can get that thing. There's a sustainable model to get that out. Thank you. I'm a big Tesla fan as well. Sandeep, thank you so much for your amazing storytelling and your wisdom. It's been an absolute. And to our listeners, thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about how to create bold, powerful change in the world, be sure to check out our book, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, or go to our website at catalystconstellations.com. If you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and I'm pretty sure you did, please take 10 seconds to rate it on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And of course, if you have other catalysts in your life, hit the share button and send a link their way. Thanks again.